bottle. Do I normally have that noise?
Oh, no.
Sorry, I came into a loud amount of machine noise. Sorry about this. Right.
Yes, my lady. Can I call Miss Nuala Toman, please?
If you'd like to repeat after me, I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Toman, thank you for coming back to help us.
Thank you.
Miss Toman, thank you for attending to give your evidence today and for providing the inquiry with a helpful witness statement, which you should have in front of you. The reference, my lady, is INQ 000588026. That statement is provided on behalf of disabled people's organizations. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And can you explain what a disabled person's organization is?
A disabled people's organisation is an organisation run for and by disabled people. We are rights-based organisations who are designed to uphold the rights of disabled people. And in the context of our particular organisation, we deliver services for and by disabled people that extend across transport, information, advice, advocacy, and mental health provision.
Your statement was prepared by you, but also by Rianne Davies and Kamran Malik. Can I ask you, which DPOs does each of you represent?
So we are a collaboration that work together. So I am Nuala Toman and I represent Disability Action Northern Ireland, which is the largest DPO in both the UK and Ireland. Rianne Davies represents Disability Wales and Cameron Malik represents Disability Rights UK, and we have all worked collaboratively together throughout the inquiry process.
You can speak personally to the situation in Northern Ireland, but you're also familiar, of course, with the whole statement since you collaborated on it, and you will be able to give evidence touching on the whole of the UK. Is that right?
That's correct.
Before we get into the detail of your evidence, Ms. Toman, can I ask you just to give us an idea of what life was like for disabled children and young people during the pandemic in the UK?
During the pandemic, life for disabled children and young people was incredibly bleak. This was a time when disabled children and young people lost access to education and services that prior to the pandemic formed core aspects of their daily life. For a disabled child and young person, the loss of routine and the loss of access to education and services is extremely detrimental. And as a result, there were increases in isolation, barriers on access to care that should have been part of everyday life, regression, increases in abuse, and increases in institutionalisation of disabled children and young people, and the withdrawal of aspects of life that should be seen to be routine and that everyone had access to. For example, through our casework, we're very aware of one of our service users who had a very happy and productive life with his family around him, and he was very much able to enjoy the world. He now lives in a closed residential setting and is almost permanently restrained, having to wear arm restraints and a helmet due to his trauma experiences and the lack of access to services during COVID, where he now is permanently stimming and injuring himself as a result. And that is a very real example of the decline that children and young people experienced during the pandemic.
Understood. Ms. Toman, I'd like to ask you now about the proportion of children and young people with disabilities in the UK. But before I do that, can I ask you, what is the social model of disability?
So the social model of disability looks at society as putting in place disabling measures for disabled people and young people so that the disability is not inherent in the person, but rather is created by the structures and formation of society and the way that we live our lives. And it largely comes from a perspective that if the principles of universal design were put in place from the outset, then disabled people, disabled children and young people would have greater access to society and a better quality of life, and that those positive changes would not only impact on disabled children and young people, but everyone.
Now, with that concept in mind of a social model of disability, can I ask you, in your statement, you refer to disability, but also special educational needs. And can I ask you, what do you mean by the terms disability and special educational needs?
So from the social model perspective, as I said, disability reflects the challenges that how our society creates for disabled people. Special educational needs provision isn't a term that disabled people's organisations have coined. It's how the education system, government, and others refer to educational provision for some disabled children and young people. I mean, we would prefer education to be universal and to be delivered in a universal manner rather than to have a provision that is labelled special educational needs. So special educational needs and special educational provision refers to a process whereby a child is assessed and in Northern Ireland would have access to a statement. It's an EHCP and in the other jurisdictions, and then based on identified requirements, then the person or the child or young person could be educated in mainstream or what is termed special educational provision.
I see. Can I ask, when we talk about disabled children or children with special educational needs, would you say that those terms are coextensive or are they different?
They are different because not every disabled child will be identified as requiring special educational needs provision.
I see.
So there's a bit of a crossover with learning disability and special educational needs, but special educational needs provision can extend into physical, so these are not blanket terms.
I see. Okay. And then turning to the proportion of children who the DPO would consider to have special educational needs or to be disabled. Can you tell us roughly what proportion of children have disability or special educational needs in England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland?
So the figures that we have access to show that there are about 2.4 million disabled children and young people under 25 in the UK. So England, that equates to 1.6 million or 18.4%, Wales 52,000 or 11.2%, Scotland about 242,000, which is 34%, and the figures that we have within the region of Northern Ireland is around 63,000, which is 18.4%.
So quite a large variation between 11% in Wales and 34% in Scotland. Can you explain the fluctuation in the percentage figures between the devolved nations?
So in terms of if we look at the different devolved nations, provision assessment, I mean, this is one of the challenges that we have in Northern Ireland as a region in itself, but across the UK, is that practices, assessments, processes, timeframes, provision are all distinctly different. So that would then lead to variations in figures. So, for example, it may be argued that Scotland have had better measures in place to identify special educational needs and to assess it in comparison to a region like ourselves, in which assessment can be challenging and difficult and time consuming.
I see. So not an inherent difference, but a difference perhaps in practice of picking up disabilities or special educational needs.
Yes.
Okay. Your statement refers to some of the compound disadvantages that disabled children face across the UK. And I'm referring here to paragraphs 84 and 105 of your statement. But can you tell us what some of those compound disadvantages are?
So, nearly half of all people in poverty are disabled people. Poverty has a very severe impact on families with disabled children, who are more reliant on food banks than other populations. And I think that is a harrowing thing for us all to accept as society, that we have a population of disabled children and young people whose families have to rely on food banks for access to food. Alongside all of that, it's important to remember that disabled children and young people are not a homogenous group, but comprise all different types, and that there are intersectional impacts on disabled children and young people in terms of gender, race, socioeconomic disadvantage, and all of those other impacts. During the pandemic, disabled children were more likely to die from COVID than other populations. And again, I think that is a very shocking example to articulate. And are more reliant on access to health and social care and education as a way of accessing life and day-to-day routine than other populations. So in the context of the pandemic, the loss of access or the loss of social care was a loss of a daily check-in in terms of the well-being and presentation of disabled children and young people. We know that disabled children and young people are more susceptible to abuse and exploitation than other populations, and that abuse and exploitation is more hidden. And there are very shocking examples of the abuse and exploitation of disabled young people. During the pandemic, Disability Action were aware of a case in which, due to the collapse of services, a single parent family were so under pressure and open to the kind of exploitation that we see, which has a particular character in Northern Ireland. And unfortunately, due to financial pressure, the pressure of the lack of support available, a mother actually sold her daughter to a member of her church, and that wasn't picked up because the routine mechanisms of presentation were not there. So access to GP provision, education, all of that was remote, and this went undetected until someone finally, the person finally became visible to Disability Action. And in that young person's words, the young person said, people could see my disability, but not my risk.
I see. I think in your statement, you also refer, as well as economic disadvantage, to some follow-on consequences for disabled children and young people, like having poor quality housing with less space. Is that right?
Yes, there is a lack of adapted housing across all aspects of the UK. So for us, we see disabled children and families routinely living in inappropriate conditions. That can be without access to appropriate equipment and, in respect of hoists, etc., but also difficulties in terms of doorway size, stairs, and all of that. And we would have a high number of casework in which families have no option but to raise their child on the ground floor of their house, which means then providing a sleeping space, care, toilet and facilities all on the ground floor of an overpopulated house. And that, I think, for all of us is challenging and shameful when we hear of it, and often very hidden.
I see. Are there particular disadvantages that children and young people with disabilities in Northern Ireland encounter, given the higher levels of deprivation there?
From our casework, we know that over 50% of visits to food banks within Northern Ireland are from disabled children and families, and that is shocking. In terms of Northern Ireland as well, the impacts of underinvestment are stark. We have inadequate housing, a lack of provision of social housing. Our trust-based social care provision means that services, the wraparound services that go with education for young people, are often delivered on a basis of a postcode lottery and vary across the region, which creates higher levels of disadvantage. Our school estate is badly in need of upgrading, and particularly the special school provision. There have been a number of approaches and consultations towards upgrading special school provision and really looking at accessibility, and unfortunately those plans have not progressed. So, children are being educated in out-of-date old buildings, and while the staff are endeavouring to provide the highest level of education, it's simply not achievable. We're in a post-conflict society where some of our communities remain under coercive control. And in the context of poverty, as an organisation, what we have seen is increased levels of exploitation and abuse that is linked to poverty, that has a particularly severe impact on disabled children and young people, in which those families that have had to access food banks have been targeted by illegal lending. And then that leads to exploitation either by the removal of medicine from families and children to be sold on the street, or worse in terms of sexual exploitation. And it is very hidden and very, very difficult to challenge, although we do our best.
I see. I just want to pick up on something you said a moment ago about children who are disabled, children and young people who are disabled being more likely to become seriously ill from COVID. And in your witness statement, I think you say that disabled children and young people have a 5-fold risk of COVID-related hospital admission and an 8-fold risk of death. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that for people aged 18 to 34, the death rate was 30 times higher for disabled children and young people than for the rest of the population. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. I'd like to move now to the access of children and young people with disabilities to education, specifically during the pandemic. In the experience of disabled people's organisations, was the UK government prepared for the decision to close schools, having regard to the potential impacts on disabled children and those with special educational needs?
No, from our perspective, there was a lack of preparation in terms of the closure of schools, and a lack of attention to the particular impacts on disabled children and young people. The infrastructure was not there to clearly identify where disabled children and young people were, and to ensure that they had access to appropriate assistive technology to continue learning in remote circumstances. We're all aware that both the education and health systems were underfunded pre-pandemic, but there are measures that could have been taken. For example, ensuring that disabled children and young people had access to appropriate technology would have been an important step. And even something like ensuring that schools and education providers had access to appropriate support to ensure that the information that they were trying to share with disabled children and young people could be accessed by them. Added to that, I think there was a lack of understanding about the impact that the withdrawal of education would have on disabled children and young people, and that regression. And that for disabled children and young people, that the withdrawal of education was just not about access to school. It was about access to sensory experiences, physiotherapy, occupational therapy, speech and language. And I think the lack of access to all of those services was invisible in terms of any planning steps that were taken forward by government across all of the jurisdictions. What is characteristic of the pandemic overall is the lack of engagement with people most impacted by decisions. So disabled people, children, families and carers were best placed to advise on what they required during the pandemic, and yet their voices remained largely unheard.
If I can just, sorry, pardon me, Nuala, if I can just pause you there for a moment. If we're talking about in particular the lack of preparation for closing schools, I think you've said in your witness statement that it was apparent to disabled people's organisations that the decision was rushed partly because there were no equality impact assessments or consultations. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And across the UK, there should be a process of assessing the impact of policy decisions that are made. That did not happen in respect of the closure of schools. Therefore, there was no opportunity to put in place mitigating, to identify and put in place mitigating provision, which meant that the impacts of the withdrawal of education on disabled children and young people went unmitigated and unconsidered, if we're really honest. And in the context of Northern Ireland, it's a really stark example. The executive had not been operational, in the advance of the pandemic, and went live again in the midst of the pandemic, although at the early stages. But given that there were no structures in place for such a long time, the executive could not have been ready to progress the decisions that they made.
I see. And so if there had been more planning, for example, there might have been time to complete equality impact assessments in consultation with organisations such as the disabled people's organisations. And that would have, if I'm following your evidence correctly, would have meant that there was more opportunity to plan and devise measures to mitigate the impacts. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So disabled people's organisations, we have networks, we provide services, therefore we have access to families who could have informed decision making, and ensured that things that would have made an impact, like the provision of technology to disabled children and families, ensuring that assistive technology was in place, and that services that were required could have been continued and protected against the regression of disabled children and young people's lives. That we're still seeing the impact of that in terms of our service provision. I mean, one of our service users, who's a young man with Down syndrome, could speak and articulate. Prior to the pandemic, he is no longer verbal because of the lack of access to speech and language therapy at that time.
I see. I'd like to ask you now about the impact of school closures and lockdown and the reductions in face-to-face contact on the identification and monitoring of safeguarding risks to disabled children. Are disabled children at increased risk of being abused compared to their peers?
Yes, I mean, disabled children and young people are 4 times more likely to experience abuse and exploitation than other populations. That abuse and exploitation is often hidden, and there are more likely to be multiple perpetrators that can extend across family service providers and the wider community. And abuse is often it's very hidden, and even when disabled children and young people articulate their experiences, they may not be addressed. And I think there are multiple examples within our jurisdiction alone where disabled children and young people have had to remain in abusive situations. So often, due to the restrictions in terms of access to accessible emergency accommodations, so back to the importance of funding services, the lack of accessible emergency provision and bespoke services means that there's often nowhere for disabled children and young people to go when they have experienced abuse and exploitation. And it can take a longer time for abuse to be identified because of the number of gatekeepers.
I see. If I can ask you, in relation specifically to the impact of the pandemic on safeguarding risks, in your witness statement at paragraph 122, you explain how the risk of abuse increased during the pandemic because, in part, residential settings became closed settings, I think you said. And that the reduction in staff in some of those settings led to increased use of physical and chemical restraints. Can you just explain to us, in terms of residential settings becoming closed settings, how was that brought about by the pandemic exactly?
So prior to the pandemic, whether it is a private home or a healthcare setting, obviously provision was open, homes were open, and there were people obviously visibly entering and leaving residential homes. But in the wider care settings, family would have had access and visitation rights that were removed during the pandemic. Therefore, the people who know disabled children and young people really well had reduced access if people were living in their, within healthcare residential settings. And it is more difficult then to identify if something has gone wrong. Now, in terms of, private residential homes, we know that during the pandemic that the increased pressure on residential homes due to the lack of access to the wider world and the imposition of restrictions, the withdrawal of social care, all of that led to an increase in domestic abuse due to, one, the lack of access to a daily check-in in terms of access to school and other service provision, but also the increased hidden, you're basically talking about a lost generation who would have had spent months, alone at home in family settings.
Okay. If I can now move on to a separate topic. You've mentioned already, I think, how for disabled children and young people, not being able to attend their schools also meant that there was a lack of access to physical therapies, for example, that they would have at their schools. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So, there are figures in my statement that show that access to physiotherapy, speech and language, and other therapies dropped by over 80%.
Yeah.
And that has a very detrimental impact on disabled children and young people.
Yeah.
Because when that loss of development is lost, it cannot be recovered.
That, I think, takes us on now to the vulnerable child policy, which I'd like to ask you about, which you deal with in your statement extensively. But the vulnerable child policy was a policy to enable some children to attend school during the lockdowns. In your statement, you point to a number of difficulties with the policy. And firstly, that those children and young people who received special educational needs support but did not have an EHC plan were not entitled to attend school. So if we just limit ourselves to that criticism for the time being. Why was it a problem that children who received the extra support but didn't have a plan weren't allowed to attend school?
So with that particular population, in the school setting, they may have had access to a classroom assistant and reasonable adjustments. Once they were effectively removed from school, all of that provision ended. There is an example within my statement of a young person who was completing their GCSEs, who would have had access to an assistant, and their education was then suffered detrimentally due to the withdrawal of that additional support. In those cases, that's also the population that was least likely to receive any reasonable adjustments. So the transition then towards any kind of electronic delivery, that's where we see the lack of compatibility with remote education provision and assistive technology, meaning that children and young people actually couldn't access the learning.
Can I just ask you there, we've heard some evidence already about remote assistive technology. Can you just give us an example of what that is in practice?
So there are many examples, but in the case that we're talking about, there is a piece of technology that can be installed remotely on a machine and can be accessible on an iPad that can read any kind of a document and any kind of website, compatible with every app, so it has multiple compatibility, and even in the access of someone, you know, who is blind or visually impaired, books can be scanned. And then this particular software can read scan text as well. So the simple installation, you know, which can be done remotely. So in the context of a pandemic, you know, the licenses are relatively low cost. I obviously don't want to name a particular product.
No, there's no need.
But the licenses are low cost. You're talking around £200 per license. You can get multi-licenses. Some universities have these on every computer.
Yeah.
You know, the simple measure to install those on every, you know, on to offer children learning at home, for that to have been installed remotely, could have happened without much additional cost to the educational system and extreme benefit, because it would have meant the removal of the barrier of not being able to access your educational materials.
I see. And so for children who might need that support, but they don't have a plan, if they're not allowed to attend school during the first lockdown and they don't have that technology, then they're not able to learn from home.
No, they
Is that
they
right?
can't access. They can't access the materials. And you know, if we're thinking of the example of deaf children, a deaf child in a hearing household would have had tremendous challenges in terms of accessing BSL or ISL.
I see.
What about those who, sorry to interrupt. No. What about those who had a plan? At the moment, I'm not quite following. So you say it would have been simple and not terribly expensive to get the technology. Did anybody get it?
Well, in the jurisdiction that we were in, no, I would say that was something. And this is where advice and working together would be really good, because as disabled people's organisations, we're very fluent in these technologies, and we work collaboratively with disabled people and families, and we could have advised some of these solutions, but we weren't asked.
Well, in fact, my lady, I was going to ask a question about this, and I'll just move to that now. So
Sorry.
No. It's actually a question that comes from a core participant. So the Department of Education for Northern Ireland has set out in its witness statement, and in fact there's no need to bring it up, but that the sensory service made arrangements in March of 2020 for all children to take their assistive technology home to enable continued access to learning. And assistive technology was available also for the new school year, so in September of 2020. So that is what the Department of Education of Northern Ireland's position is. Does that accord with the experience of your members?
So there were significant challenges in terms of disabled children and families accessing the sensory service because it was oversubscribed. And while attempts were made to provide people with their assistive technology at home, the issue is the compatibility of that technology with the remote learning. So in many cases, what had been provided wasn't compatible with the way in which the remote learning was being delivered.
I see. Okay. Now, if we can just move back, and I'm sorry to move you around, to the vulnerable children policy, just to finish off. We've spoke already about the issue with children receiving SEND support who weren't allowed to attend school. But even those who had a plan, an EHCP plan, who were able to attend school following a risk assessment. I'm going to take you now to a report from the Children's Commissioner titled Childhood in the Time of COVID, published very efficiently up on our screens right now, published in September 2020. And we can see here, this is percentage of children with an EHCP attending school during lockdown. And we can see the number fluctuating. It seems to get down to about 2% on the 13th of April, and then goes up to just over 30% by July. If we can just zoom out from that graph, please. Yes. We can see in the writing at the top there, attendance figures show that only 6% of children with EHCPs attended school on average from the start of lockdown until the end of May. So the policy which permitted children with a plan to attend, nevertheless, the vast majority of those children did not attend, only 6% on average. Does that accord with the experience of your members?
Yes, we know from working with disabled children and families that there was a very low proportion of children who had access to school. We know that risk assessments were challenging to access and difficult. We know that access was patchy, and at times that there were less than 1% of children with HCP plans or statements within education. We know that parents and families found the risk assessment process challenging and felt that it discouraged them from sending their child to school rather than encouraging, because of the high levels of fear and anxiety and concerns of what school would be like.
I see.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. The Children's Commissioner also, in this report, yes, at the bottom of the page there, shows that in a survey of parents of children with special educational needs and disabilities, 75% said that risk assessments did not take place. And of course, a risk assessment was necessary in order for a child to take up their place. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So without a risk assessment, a disabled child or young person could not access education. And we have to remember that at the time of the pandemic, once services were withdrawn and access was lowered, it was so difficult to put provision back in place because of the weakness within the infrastructure and the pressure on the system that was increased by the introduction of COVID-19 related measures. There was an overall lack of investment in mitigating measures that would have assisted disabled children and young people. And if we look at how the COVID-19 pandemic played out, a lot of the attention was directed towards other measures that would not directly have impacted on disabled children and young people. You know, for example, the furlough scheme, while it may have supported a parent to be within the home, it's very different to actually invest in accessible provision for disabled children and young people during the pandemic.
Yes. If I can just ask you, in relation to provision specifically for disabled children during the pandemic, in your statement, you refer to concerns that special schools in Northern Ireland were too quick to close across the country, often before mainstream schools closed. And that would mean that even if a disabled child was eligible to attend school, they would need to go maybe to a different school if one could be found, where they would not receive the educational support necessarily that they required. In your statement, you cite a BBC News article about the closure of 10 special schools in Belfast. As far as you're aware, did those schools reopen quickly following a risk assessment? Do you know?
So the process around what happened in respect of the closure of schools, I think if we reflect back to the time of the pandemic, what happened in Northern Ireland was different to other jurisdictions in the UK. Decisions were often made in respect of what was happening in other jurisdictions rather than what was required within Northern Ireland. So the schools closed quickly prior to wider school closures. Parents, children, guardians and families were left without access to health and social care and without access to education. When schools did reopen, that was, from our perspective, as a result of wider societal pressure, because people were left with very limited options. So once there was pressure put upon the system to reopen, then some schools did reopen, but that didn't mean that children had access to education. Provision was patchy, difficult to access. Risk assessments were difficult to access and to navigate. Families were overwhelmed by both the lack of specific information in relation to their child or children and the more generic information that was publicly available through media. And this led to a very challenging time. Some of the easements around looking at, the move towards like reasonable endeavours led to an erosion of children's rights. I mean, effectively what we saw during the pandemic is that children lost their right to access education.
Yes, sorry, I'll just pause you there because I'm just about to move on to the impact of easements, just keeping an eye on the time. So there were changes to the absolute duty on local authorities to deliver special educational and health provision set out in a child's EHCP plan. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
And so prior to these statutory changes, there was an absolute duty on local authorities to secure the special provision set out in the EHCP plan. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And the disabled people's organisations have expressed concern that a reduction in support for children and young people with special educational needs during the pandemic was facilitated by easements of core statutory duties. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, so what we saw was a regression in children's rights. And again, these changes were enacted without consultation. And often parents, children, carers found out after the event
that the changes had been made. And just so that we're clear, when we're talking about the Coronavirus Act 2020, which you refer to in your statement, it modified the obligations on local authorities so that the duty to secure provision was treated as it was discharged if the local authority had used reasonable endeavours to secure the provision. Is that right?
That's correct.
So instead of there being an absolute obligation, it was reasonable endeavours. And in Northern Ireland in particular, the Department of Education reduced the duty on health and social care trusts regarding the special educational framework to best endeavours from the 2nd of April of 2020. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Can you also tell us about the changes to the time limits for the completion of EHCP assessments and finalising plans?
So, changes to the statutory nature of provision reduced children's rights, and then obviously what we saw during the pandemic and post-pandemic is an increase in waiting times for the completion of assessments, which leaves disabled children and young people behind without provision and without access to adequate provision.
Okay. And I think in your statement you mentioned a concern about the message that these easements was sending. Can you just tell us what message you feel was given to local authorities by these changes?
Well, the reduction in entitlement, from our perspective, led to the further invisibility of disabled children and young people. The standards of provision dropped. Access to wraparound service provision also dropped. So not only did disabled children not have access to education, but they didn't have access to all of those important services like physiotherapy, occupational therapy, occupational health, speech and language, sensory provision, which ultimately led to regression. And we have yet to see the visibility of disabled children and young people returned to pre-pandemic levels. And from our perspective, some disabled children and young people's lives have been destroyed. I mean, we have as one of our service users, it's a very happy and content young woman who is currently in a locked ward, and does not have access to society due to the regression in her speech and her physical presentation, and also the impact of trauma and how she stims. And that cannot be recovered to the level pre-pandemic.
I see.
Can I just ask, and I'm sorry I'm interrupting again, I know you're fighting the clock, Ms. Buttle. I do understand the importance to these children who, as you say, their lives have been destroyed, and I totally and utterly understand the importance of planning. But if you have a national emergency, as we did, and local authorities had staff absences, staff deployed, everybody chasing their tail, trying to do a dozen things at once, what else could have been done in those circumstances? So, yes, I understand what you're saying, as in the consequences, but are you saying something else should have been done, and if so, what?
So it all comes back to engagement and co-design. And there is a timeline for the pandemic, in terms of those winter months progressing, when cases emerged, where disabled children and young people, families and carers could have been engaged with, identified, and measures put in place. I mean, for us, we are the organisations, and we work with organisations who have the solutions and an understanding of what should have been prioritised. And those conversations did not happen. Sometimes the focus around social distancing, PPE, and all of those measures took away from the human element. And what, for us, the starting point should have been, how do we identify disabled children and young people? How do we know where they are? And how do we ensure that they have access to the best possible provision that they can have through, during a national emergency? And And there are simple things that could have been done, like consideration given to how do we provide health and social care safely so that the burden isn't placed on informal carers. How do we ensure that children and young people, those who were most at risk of abuse and exploitation, are protected? You know, things like, could there have been a mechanism put in place for check-ins that could have been done safely? As you know, organisations such as ourselves, we did step in, have stepped in, and continue to step in and pick up the pieces for statutory provision, but we could have advised statutory provision how to be more stable in that context. I mean, those simple measures around how do you ensure that there is compatibility between assistive technology and educational technology? Are there ways to provide remote sensory experiences? You know, there are lots of conversations that could have been had that did not, and unfortunately, the decisions that were made resulted in serious detrimental impacts on a very invisible population that remain invisible to this day.
And I suppose if we're discussing now the easements to statutory duties, is the DPO's position that those easements should not have been brought into force?
Sorry, I just have to ask you to repeat that.
Of course. If we're talking now about easements to statutory duties, for example, in relation to EHCP plans, is the DPO's position that those changes to the statutory obligations should not have been made?
So in terms of the reasonable endeavours, etc., yes, we could see that as an erosion of children's rights. There was a better way, without doubt. You know, even as we sit here today in this inquiry, when I'm doing my best, I do have to say that it is difficult because I am not a child or a young person. And one of the most serious aspects of the pandemic is the lack of voice that was given to children and young people. And measures like the introduction of reasonable endeavours without consultation, without input, led to further erosion of rights. And I think we have yet to see services reinstated to pre-pandemic levels, and to see that those rights are upheld. From our perspective, we feel that working with children's organisations, disabled people organisations and others, that a stability of service provision could have safely been maintained. And that may not have been perfect, but it would have been better than what happened.
Okay. You've mentioned the importance of consultation before the making of changes. I have a question to ask on behalf of the Department for Education for Northern Ireland. Do you agree that your organisation, Danny, often worked collaboratively with the Department for Education to protect and enhance the rights of disabled children and young people, and that the department did its best to identify solutions in what were often demanding circumstances?
I think we have to go back to the timing that there was there. So the pandemic emerged just at the end of a political crisis. So any engagement that we would have had with the Department of Education in the run-up to the pandemic at any planning stage was in the context of the absence of ministers and the absence of any framework for ministerial decision-making. So at that time, if anything was to be put in place, it had to be in the basis of ministerial direction, which was on the basis of a decision made by the prior minister who was in place. That effectively meant that there was no process for change or movement beyond what was already outlined in statute and practice for a period from 2017 right up to the reinstatement of the executive. So that meant that all of the formal consultation mechanisms that you see within a government were gone, and they could not be reinstated in time for pre-pandemic planning to be put in place, or indeed throughout throughout the purpose of throughout the life of the pandemic. So while the department may have tried, they couldn't possibly, because of the lack of infrastructure, the lack of investment, they couldn't possibly have properly engaged with an organisation such as ourselves. For example, during the collapse, we would have only had access to all party groups as opposed to committees, etc. And once it's like once infrastructure is broken, it is very, very difficult to reinstate it.
I see.
And Northern Ireland as a jurisdiction, it's slow to enact change, and we're still seeing challenges in terms of redressing problems that emerged during the pandemic due to our legislative time scale, etc.
Thank you for that answer. We are just, I'm afraid, running out of time, but there's one matter which I've been asked to clarify. I asked you a moment ago about the increased risks for disabled children and young people, the increased risk of death as a result of the virus. And what I said was that for people aged 18 to 34, the death rate was 30 times higher for disabled children and young people. But in fact, what I should have said is that the disproportionate mortality rates relate to children and young people with learning disabilities.
Yes.
Yeah, so my mistake, but I just wanted to clarify.
I think that is one of the challenges when we look at statistics in terms of terminology, etc. It is difficult. And for an organisation like ourselves, where we try not to disaggregate disability by label, for us then it's challenging for us to identify any error such as that, because we prefer to use disabled as a collective term rather than focus on individual disabilities.
Yes. Yeah. But that was my error, so I apologise. In the last 2 minutes that we have, I'd just like to ask you, what recommendations would you make to improve the government response in any future pandemic to safeguard the rights of disabled children and young people?
I think the first step is to come from the perspective of the voice of the child, which is a right for children and young people, and ensure that there are measures in place that the voice of children and young people, including disabled children and young people, is heard and responded to within policy and practice development. And I think that is key. One of the weaknesses throughout the pandemic was the lack of engagement with organisations and with people with lived experience. And services are better designed if they're delivered collaboratively with the people that they most impact on. So that's a significant lesson. I think as well, there needs to be an increased investment in service provision across the piece, and that when decisions are made about investing in public services, that they are, one, co-designed, but two, come from a perspective of how you have the most positive impact on disabled children and young people. The example being that investment in PPE may have been important, but equally so, investment in remote sensory provision is equally important. There are so many lessons, to be learned.
Well, and also in your statement, you've, from paragraph 151 onwards, given the inquiry a list, a very helpful list of recommendations for the future. So I think, Ms. Toman, that is the end of my questions for you today. I don't know, my lady, if you have any further questions.
No, I have no more questions. I'm really grateful to you, Ms. Toman, and please don't worry if we haven't gone through everything that you said in your written statement. Obviously, I'm going to read all the material that I need to before I make my recommendations, and also you have very, very able legal representatives who I know will make sure I understand the points that you would have made had we gone further.
Thank you.
So thank you very much indeed for all your help.
Thank you.
Thank you. My lady, next we have Miss Sammy McFarland to give evidence.
If you'd like to take the Bible in your right hand and repeat after me, I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Please sit down.
Yes. Ms. McFarland, thank you for attending to give your evidence today. You've also provided a helpful witness statement to this inquiry, which is reference INQ 000588023, which you should have in front of you. Ms. McFarland, I'll begin by asking you about your professional background and the setting up of long COVID kids. What is your professional background?
So before the pandemic started, I was a Pilates and health coach specialising in women's health and fitness. And before that, I worked as a nursery nurse and maternity nurse.
Thank you. You set up Long COVID Kids with Frances Simpson in September of 2020, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. How did you and Frances come to set up this organisation?
So after our children got sick, we connected online, and Frances had published an article which I had read in the BMJ, and I asked her if she would validate my concerns and work with me on trying to pull together families.
And Long COVID Kids supports, represents, and advocates for children and young people who are living with ongoing symptoms of long COVID. Is that right?
It is, yes.
And the organization advocated for mitigation measures in schools, improved indoor air quality, further research, and vaccination. It is a volunteer organization and supports about 11,000 families. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. Does Long COVID Kids operate throughout the UK?
It does, yes.
It operates in Scotland, I believe.
Yes.
And we have a statement also helpfully provided to the inquiry from Miss Helen Goss. Can you help us with the nature and extent of Long COVID Kids' involvement with Northern Ireland?
So we have a representative for Northern Ireland who fed back to all of us about the experiences of the families there. Our representative has a daughter who's very sick with long COVID, and he helped her to advocate by writing letters and sharing her experience throughout the early pandemic.
And did that representative engage with the Northern Ireland administration? Do you know?
So there wasn't a coordinated approach. Several young people wrote letters in an attempt to get engagement, but there's no action that we know of.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask you now some questions about the impact of long COVID on children and young people. I'd like to begin by reading out a passage from the Children and Young Persons Voices report, which was commissioned by this inquiry to hear directly from children and young people. Yes, very efficiently brought up on screen already. And for the record, the reference is INQ 000587936. Children and young people who reported severe lingering post-viral conditions described distressing and persistent health impacts due to their illness. Examples of impacts on physical health included frequent hospital appointments due to chest pain and needing to use a wheelchair due to mobility issues. Those interviewed included some who were classified as disabled due to their illness. And one account received from an individual aged 17 years old is, "I've been mostly housebound these last 3 years. And if I do need to go out and walk, in more than 5 minutes to hospital appointments or just for fun, I need a wheelchair. So yeah, it's pretty unrecognizable from how I was in 2019. Does this account accord with the lived experience of your members?
Yes, it does.
Okay. To give us a sense of the proportion, that can come down now, thank you. To give us a sense of the proportion of children and young people affected by long COVID, you touch on the numbers at paragraphs 23 and 28 of your witness statement. But could you tell us roughly how prevalent long COVID is?
What we know from the ONS statistics is there's over 100,000 children and young people in England and Scotland alone living with long COVID, and it's likely that those figures are grossly unrepresentative of the actual figures.
Amount. So if I can, in your statement at paragraphs 23 and 28, you cite the US Recover study, and that states that nearly 6 million children are living with long COVID, and that it affects up to 10 to 20% of children with a history of COVID. Does that sound about right to you?
Yes.
Yeah. And the US Recover study is obviously focused on children and young people in the United States. Is that right? Yeah.
That's
okay.
right.
And in your statement, you cite the ONS statistics, and you say that in the UK, tens of thousands of children and young people are affected. The ONS last estimated that almost 66,000 children suffer from long COVID symptoms for more than 12 weeks. Does that sound right?
That's right.
Okay. And can you help us, and you might not be able to, but with whether those ONS figures relate to Northern Ireland?
So I believe the first set of ONS statistics did, and then
Okay.
the latter ones did not.
Okay. And the ONS figures are for children suffering symptoms for more than 12 weeks. And that would encompass, I imagine, quite mild symptoms, but also the kind of serious and debilitating symptoms that some children and young people suffer, as set out in the Young Voices report. Can you help us with whether there are any statistics on severe long COVID?
No, I think really that's an area that we need data and further research. Children who with severe symptoms have been overlooked. They're often unable to attend medical appointments, so they're missing behind closed doors.
I see. Your witness statement details the impact of long COVID on children and young people's education. And Long COVID Kids launched the Attendance and Education Experiences Survey in collaboration with the University of Derby in February of 2023. And at paragraph 85 of your witness statement, you set out the aims of the survey. So it was to gather detailed information about the educational experiences and attendance patterns for children and young people with long COVID in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And can I ask you, how many responses did Long COVID Kids receive to that survey?
We received 317 responses from children and young people between the ages of 5 to 19 years.
Okay. And can you tell us whether any of those responses came from Northern Ireland?
A small proportion, but I'd have to come back to you with the exact figures.
Okay. And participants in this survey, they were recruited, I believe there were requests for their involvement posted on Long COVID Kids' social media channels. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. And just before the break, if I can ask you about what the survey found, and it's not a memory test, so it's dealt with at paragraph 88 of your statement, if that helps you.
Thank you. So the full results of the survey are being prepared for publication at the moment. We found that 69% of respondents reported that their education status had been affected in some way by SARS-CoV-2 infection. We found that a child with long COVID will lose an average of 20.6 learning hours per week when scaled up to the total respondents of this survey. It's over 100,000 lost learning hours per year. We found that 10.4% of respondents are currently temporarily away from school or college, sick, and that 9.5% are currently too unwell to be in education at all. And 75% of respondents reported that their attendance had been greatly impacted, with 54% saying that their progress with learning had been greatly impacted. 40% of respondents thought that the school lacked an understanding of the impact that long COVID had on their child or their young person's education, and 25% had experienced pressure from schools to send their child or young person to school when they have been unwell, and we still hear about that every single day now.
Pressure for unwell children to attend school?
Yes.
I see. We have just a few minutes before the break, so I'll ask you another question. You referred in your statement to the Cosmo study, which my lady will hear more about in the course of these hearings. But the study is the largest of its kind into the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and the cost of living crisis on the life chances of a generation of young people. And you've referred in your statement to a briefing published in January of 2023 following the Wave 1 initial findings. And if we can pull up a quote from the study, which you've included in your witness statement. Yes, at paragraph 99. When considering the severity of long COVID, it is apparent that having long COVID with a severe effect on everyday life is consistently associated with lower GCSE scores. Having severe long COVID is linked with about a 0.3 standard deviation decrease in teacher-assessed GCSE scores. The findings show that pupils with long COVID with a severe effect on everyday life achieved lower scores than their peers who did not suffer from this experience when all other variables are held constant. Severe long COVID is therefore a risk factor for young people's educational attainment. The long-term disruption to a young person's education, daily life, and potentially to their mental health of having severe long COVID may be a possible explanation for this pattern. Does the results from the Cosmo study accord with the lived experience of your members?
Somewhat, yes.
Okay. I think I'll pause there. We're due a break, my lady.
Thank you, Ms. Butler. I think we'll break now. I hope you understand, we take a regular break for everyone's sake, but especially the stenographer. So I shall return at 11:30.
All rise.
Yes. Ms. McFarlane, just before the break, we were discussing the Cosmo study, touching on the impact of the pandemic on children and young people who have long COVID, on their education. Mm-hmm. You highlight in your witness statement the unequal burden of long COVID according to people's social background, children and young people's social background. Can you tell us about research concerning this unequal burden? And for your reference, it's dealt with at paragraph 167 of your witness statement.
Thank you. So this is in reference to the Cosmo study, which reported that patterns of long COVID were also found to vary by young people's social background. 1 in 5 comprehensive state school students who reported having COVID-19 either currently have or previously had long COVID, compared to 1 in 6 grammar and independent schools, school pupils, 16%. Furthermore, the study found that those from the most disadvantaged areas of the country are more likely to report long COVID compared to those from the least deprived areas, 25% versus 18%. These findings further illustrate the unequal burden of long COVID on children and young people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and they highlight the need for targeted support and the importance of addressing structural inequalities in both research and service provision. This should be a key area of investigation for the inquiry.
Thank you. I'd like to move on now to a new topic, which is the government response to long COVID in children and young people. Dealing first with the issue of communication about the risks of long COVID, your statement sets out the absence of communication about the risks of long COVID to children and young people and their families. And that's dealt with in your statement at paragraphs 33 to 39. And I'm going to ask you in particular about a statement made by the UK's chief medical officers. So a statement was made on the 23rd of August of 2020, just before schools were to return in the autumn term, in which they said that the risks to children and young people were low, and very few, if any, children or teenagers will come to long-term harm from COVID-19 due to solely attending school. In your view, did this statement give parents the necessary information about the risks of COVID infections for children and young people?
Absolutely not. This statement misled parents to believe that children and young people were unlikely to be harmed by infection, and as a result, our support group was filling up with families desperate for help.
I think you've said in your statement that you appreciate the need, perhaps, for the chief medical officers to reassure parents. What do you think, in your view and that of your members, should have been done differently, bearing in mind that need to reassure parents as well, to provide information about long COVID?
So I feel like there's a balance between reassurance and the facts. And as parents, we want to know the facts about how to protect our children. Responsible health communications would consider how the media will interpret them, because it's often the media that families see reporting information if they're not specifically seeking it out. And I find it extraordinary that the precautionary approach was not taken with regard to children's health, particularly given the well-established knowledge that post-acute sequelae from other viral diseases and what they can do and how they can affect children.
I see. I'm going to take you now to some email correspondence between the Chief Medical Officer for England, from whom we'll hear at the time, Professor Sir Chris Whitty. So email correspondence in May 2020, in which concerns regarding the emergence of pediatric multisystem inflammatory syndrome were discussed. So we'll bring up the email now. It's INQ 0000699216. And if we can start just on page 2. Unfortunately, some text has been redacted about the recipients, but I can say that it is an email from Russell Viner, who, my lady, you'll hear from later on in the hearings, from the Royal College of Child and Paediatric Health. And it is an email to Professor Sir Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance about pediatric multi-system inflammatory syndrome, dated the 12th of May. And in that email, we can see it is a discussion about concern. So it says, we had an updated call yesterday, which somewhat raised my level of concern and changed the picture slightly. So thought you should be in the picture. I have real concerns about how we balance this with the issues about public confidence in schools. And he sets out the sort of numbers that they're concerned with. And the severity of the syndrome. And then if we can scroll up now, pardon me, just to page 1, we can see a response here from Patrick Valance saying, this is concerning, as you say, and will raise anxiety amongst the public. It's very important that it's researched properly. And then if we scroll further up the page, we can see an email from Professor Sir Chris Whitty, at the very top there, in which he responds saying that about the kind of research that he thinks would be appropriate into this issue. So the email sets out that there was knowledge, of course, in May of 2020 about pediatric multisystem inflammatory syndrome, which is another post-viral sequelae of COVID-19. We can take that down now. What messaging do you think ought to have been given to the public by the chief medical officer following this sort of knowledge in May of 2020?
Absolute clarity that families needed to protect their children. They needed information to make informed decisions, and without that information, many families didn't know to protect their children, and now they're members of our group.
I see. I've already asked you about the statement and your witness statement about the need to reassure members of the public. But if we're concerned ourselves at the moment with the return to school in September of 2020 and the consensus statement made by the chief medical officers, do you think that, considering the importance of education to children and young people, that it was necessary for public health bodies to reassure parents that children had a much lower rate of hospitalization and severe disease? Would you accept that?
Somewhat accept that. I think that you can't look at just the hospitalizations on their own when by then we had huge numbers of families coming forward with what was happening in the community. And in my own case, we weren't able to get our daughter into hospital because the hospital was only interested in whether she could breathe or not. The fact that she was unable to leave her bed was not of interest to them.
I see. I'm going to ask you now about the school's policy, touching on long COVID in children and young people. What was your members' experience of school support for pupils and families with long COVID?
Sorry, would you mind asking that question again? Sorry.
Of course. What was your members' experience of the school support for pupils and families with long COVID?
Nothing. There was no support. There was no understanding. There was no guidance for schools. Worse than that, families were experiencing sort of punitive measures with not attending and complete lack of belief. The schools wanted medical documents, which we couldn't get because healthcare professionals didn't know anything about long COVID. There was no support there either. So the whole system just crumbled and children were left abandoned.
What could schools have done better to support children and young people with long COVID to access their education?
Well, they needed guidance. They needed clear guidance because as an organisation, we tried to provide guidance and help families, help schools to support families. But there wasn't any, and because it wasn't coming from the Department of Education, schools were reluctant to accept any other information. But they needed flexible and hybrid learning options. They needed a flexible timetable. They needed different ways of accessing education, one-to-one support, mobility needs in schools. The list goes on, and without, it didn't matter what anyone said, if it wasn't coming from the Department of Education, it was just a flat answer of no.
Okay. We'll go on later on in your evidence to deal with the issue of guidance from the Department for Education. But just for now, we can say that no guidance was issued. Is that right?
No.
Okay. In terms of the medical response to long COVID, what difficulties did your members face in getting access to specialist pediatric care?
Well, initially there was no care. Our members reported that they couldn't even get their GPs to believe that their children were sick. The narrative at that time was that children did not get sick from COVID. And there was a lot of pressure on families to send their children back to education or to make them try harder. And as a result of that, it left very overwhelmed and isolated families struggling, which had placed additional burden on them on top of the wider pandemic experience.
In your witness statement, you also refer to a failure to apply the NICE guidance, which was published in late 2021. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And a failure to collect and report routine data.
That's right.
Is that right? Okay. And an absence of a clinical case definition until February of 2023.
That's right.
Okay. I'm going to take you now to the Children and Young People's Voice report. Thank you very much. It's INQ 000587936. Children and young people with post-viral conditions described assessment and treatment journeys that were uncertain, emotionally challenging, and complex. This included some of those with long COVID, and all of those interviewed who were eventually diagnosed with PIMS, likely due to limited awareness of the condition. And then if we turn over to page 143, this is an account of a child aged 17 years old. I felt like I was kind of like pushed around. Nobody wanted my case. My feeling is that the mental health people had no idea of what ME, which is chronic fatigue syndrome, is or what long COVID is. So you just find yourself having to explain again and again. And when it got to crisis point, my mom had to really sit me down and beg me to try and talk to people, because at that point I was so wary of any sort of counselor or therapist. Have your members experienced a similar lack of understanding from healthcare professionals?
Yes, it's commonly reported in the group that children and young people don't want to talk about their mental health for fear of having their physical symptoms minimised.
I'm going to ask you now about the school awareness pack. Long COVID Kids prepared a school awareness pack to address the lack of guidance in place for schools with pupils who suffered from long COVID. Is that right?
That's right.
And can you just give us an idea of the kind of information that was in the school awareness pack?
So it was essentially information to try and help families reduce the risk of SARS-CoV-2 infection. We shared the updated information from the government because it was changing so quickly, it was difficult to keep up with. We talked about ways that schools could reduce risks for children and try and help them with clean air, with air filtration.
If I can just pause you there. So reduce the risk of infection.
Reduce the risk of infection.
Yeah.
And we shared any information that was available to try and help give families the information to make their own informed decisions.
Okay. In May of 2021, the Department for Education prepared a note on long COVID as an internal document, which acknowledged the need for schools to be provided with official information on the disease. The note included a reference to misinformation and a concern that the awareness pack overstated the risk. If we can pull it up, please. The note itself is INQ 000542722. And we're looking here, it should be on your screen, Ms. McFarlane, paragraphs 15 to 18. It says, PHE and DHSC have raised concerns about the potential spread of misinformation on long COVID in children. The advocacy group Long COVID Kids have produced a school awareness pack. The Scottish Government has received correspondence asking whether it would be distributing the pack to schools. There is concern that this misinformation could be directly distributed to schools. PHE and DHSC are concerned that the information pack risks overstating the prevalence of long COVID in children, which some children may suffer from. Post-COVID symptoms, these may not hugely differ from other post-viral symptoms. Long COVID kids are also calling for robust aerosol transmission mitigation measures in schools and policies on school attendance and return to school, as well as greater public awareness of long COVID in children. And then, just the paragraph 18, we are discussing options with PHE and DHSC. One route is for PHE and DHSC to provide key messages and guidance on long COVID in children, which DFE could help to distribute via our comms channels and links with schools. And what I'd like to ask you is, firstly, did long COVID kids have any direct engagement with the government about the school awareness packs?
No, we tried, but there was no engagement.
Okay. The note refers to an option of providing guidance on long COVID from the department. Did that happen?
No, it did not.
Okay. How did you feel when you read about this reaction from the Department for Education to the school awareness pack?
I was angry. We tried so hard to raise awareness and to get people to listen. And when I read that, it made me realise that we never stood a chance of getting the truth out because they didn't want it to be out. Our information wasn't misinformation. The misinformation was hiding the facts from families.
I'd like to ask you about long COVID kids' engagement with the Northern Ireland Department of Health or other Northern Irish public authorities about long COVID. Has long COVID kids engaged with these bodies?
I'm so sorry. Would you mind asking that again?
Of course.
My apologies.
Would you like a moment?
No, it's fine. Thank you.
Okay. I'd like to ask you about long COVID kids' engagement with the Northern Ireland Department of Health or other Northern Irish public authorities about long COVID. Has long COVID kids engaged with these bodies?
We have not. We've tried.
Okay. I'd also like to ask you whether long COVID kids has had engagement with the Welsh Government or public health authorities.
Again, we've tried.
Okay. To the extent that it has not already been covered in your evidence, can you tell us of long COVID kids' overarching assessment of the approach of the governments of the UK to long COVID in children?
Our children were dismissed, minimised, gaslit, ignored, hidden, and that continues to be the case now, that there hasn't been any correction to the early messaging. The government has not treated our children as part of society. And what happened to our children could happen to any child. And all we ever wanted to do was raise the alarm. And when we did that, when we shared information, we thought that they would be interested and that they would pick it up and that they would make a difference. And they didn't. And so we just kept going, because what alternative was there?
Finally, Ms. McFarlane, I'd like to ask you about the impact of long COVID on your daughter. You set out in your witness statement a case study about a child, Kay, and that is your daughter, is that right?
It is, yes.
Yes. Can you tell us what your family's experience was with long COVID with your daughter?
So my daughter and I both got COVID in March 2020. Me first and Kitty very quickly after. My daughter, she had initially mild symptoms, and then within 4 weeks of the original infection, it became very clear that she was not recovering. Initially, her symptoms were high fevers. She was translucent. Her skin was translucent. She couldn't feed herself. She couldn't do her personal care. She couldn't leave her bed. She would crawl along the landing to get to the toilet. Being upright on the toilet was impossible for her. She would have seizures. She had severe pain, heart palpitations. It was horrendous. She still lives with those symptoms, although better managed, but only because we've accessed private care. It's been life-changing, and as a family, at the time, there was no information. One time we tried to speak to a healthcare professional at a medical appointment for me, because they were not giving medical appointments to children at the GP surgery. And I was told that my daughter was mimicking my symptoms, even though they had never seen my daughter, and that she would be fine when she got back with her friends. Later on, we tried to call 111, and as I mentioned earlier, we were told if she was breathing, she didn't need medical help. And we were so terrified. We were doing 20 minutes observations on her because she was unable to talk. And yet they just kept saying that children didn't get sick. And because of that, we just couldn't get anyone to believe us. The implications were it was a mental health problem because she was not with her friends. And yet she was desperately, desperately sick.
Thank you, Ms. McFarlane. My lady, there is one question.
There is?
Approved.
Miss Iyengar, just there.
Thank you, my lady. Ms. McFarlane, I'll be asking you some questions about a document that's been disclosed from the Department of Education. It's INQ 000542824, and it will shortly appear on our screens. As it comes up, I can tell you that the first page we will see that these are meeting minutes of a permanent stakeholder group meeting from the 9th of June. It should be on your screen. And I can reliably tell you that this refers to the year 2021. And we see at page 1 a number of attendees, representatives from the Local Government Association, teachers' unions, the National Children's Bureau, schools, colleges, the DofE, and then on the left, under PHE, which denotes Public Health England, Dr. Shamez Ladani is listed as attending. And we also see apologies from the Children's Commissioner and other invitees. Were long COVID kids ever invited to attend the Permanent Secretary Stakeholder Group meetings on education?
No, we were not.
And if we scroll down in the same document, page 3, paragraph 2.2, we see that Dr. Shamez Ladani joined the discussion to explain research into long COVID. And I'd like us to look together at the 4th bullet point under 2.2. I hope that will be zoomed in on very shortly. The last line of that bullet point notes, Dr. Ladani was clear that children should not be labelled with long COVID, i.e. a medical condition, as this has potential to cause longer-term psychological harm. Ms. McFarlane, what is your reaction to reading what was advised by the representative from Public Health England?
It cut me to the absolute core when I read that. That's the representative that should be representing my child and the other children. And he says label, I say diagnosis, and without a diagnosis, our children were unable to access care or to be believed, and that put additional pressure on families and children, young people themselves. It brought additional stigma. It makes me wonder if they wanted a barrier to stop our children being diagnosed because they didn't want people to understand the amount of children that were getting sick.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much. That completes the questions we have. I appreciate you found it very distressing, so I'm particularly grateful to you for coming along. And I hope, as you say, that you've managed to access private care. I hope your daughter does improve. How old is she now?
She's 19, she'll be 20 next week.
Right. Well, I hope that she does manage to get her life back on track.
Thank you.
And thank you for all you've done to support other people in your position. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And thank you to your colleagues who helped with the inquiry.
Thank you.
Ms. Traynor.
My lady, the next witness is Kate Anstey.
Just like to repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Please sit down.
I hope we haven't kept you waiting too long, Ms. Anstey.
All good, thank you.
Good afternoon, Miss Anstey. Thank you for attending today and for the provision of your witness statement, which is dated the 23rd of July 2025. That is at INQ 000650990, and the final page thereof contains your signed declaration as to the truth of its contents. Miss Anstey, you are given your evidence today in your capacity as Head of Education Policy at Child Poverty Action Group, a role you've held since 2023, I think.
Yes.
By way of introduction, could you provide us with an overview of the work of Child Poverty Action Group?
Yeah, of course. So at Child Poverty Action Group, we work on behalf of children and young people across the UK who are growing up in poverty. We do that in different ways. We work to understand what causes poverty, the impact that has on children's lives, and also what solutions are needed to lift children out of poverty. And within that, we have different mechanisms. So we have our sort of policy and advocacy work, and that's part of the work that I do. We also do welfare rights support work, as well as our strategic litigation work. And I suppose within the context of the pandemic, we were very much looking to continue that work and understand how the pandemic was affecting particularly low-income families and children during that period. So continuing to research, talk to families, analyse policies, and share the findings and evidence from that.
Thank you. And you said a moment ago that your work extends across the UK. Can I ask, it appears from your statement that perhaps you have a less established presence in Northern Ireland, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So while we are a UK-wide charity and we look at data and analysis across the UK in terms of our research work, the survey work, the focus groups, etc., that we do with children and families, that is predominantly in Scotland, England, and Wales.
Okay, and generally speaking, are rates of child poverty consistent across the UK?
So they do vary very slightly across the nations, particularly in Scotland. Child poverty rates are lower, and that's because there are certain policies that have been put in place in Scotland to mitigate some of the effects of child poverty. Things like the Scottish Child Payment, for example, have worked to bring down child poverty rates. But across the other nations, child poverty remains around 31%, and that is roughly kind of 9 children in a classroom of 30 when we're trying to sort of kind of visualise that. And that is a number that has been steadily rising, although there have been some kind of, there were kind of changes to that which we can go into later, but that figure has been rising at UK level, particularly since 2010. And some of the drivers of that are some of the cuts and freezes that were made to the social security system during the 2010s period. So to pick out a couple, the 2-child limit and the benefit cap are particular causes of kind of rising child poverty over that period.
Thank you, Ms. Anstey. I'd like to just begin your evidence really by establishing with you what the term child poverty encompasses and how it's measured. So in terms of how child poverty is defined, I understand that most definitions of child poverty include reference to lacking the financial resources to meet a basic standard of living relative to what is commonplace in society. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So when we're talking about poverty and child poverty, we're talking predominantly about money and households not having enough money to afford the things that they need, as you say, to kind of take part in the things that most people in society can. So whether that's being able to afford food or decent housing, or being able to take part in activities like school trips. When we think about, so that's the kind of how we set that in the context of the day-to-day lives of families. When we're thinking about the measure of child poverty, it is there is a technical measure, and to kind of establish how many children and families are living in poverty, we use the DWP's HBAI data set. That has actually a number of measures within it of child poverty, but as CPAG, our preferred measure and the one that is most widely used is a relative income measure, and also a measure that's where we're looking at families after housing costs have been taken into account. So for a child to be living in poverty, they will be in a household where that household's income is 60% or below the median income in society in that year. As I say, the reason that we prefer this relative measure is because we really think it's important to look at children's experiences kind of set in the context of today and relative to today's living standards. There are kind of absolute measures of poverty that anchor to a date in the past, so 2010 is the current date that's used, but as I say, we don't feel that that's relevant to what children are experiencing now. And also the reason we look at that after housing cost piece is because housing is a kind of unavoidable cost, so it's really important for us to understand, once that's taken into account, where families sit in terms of that poverty line that I set out. And that's, as I say, the measure that we use. I think it's important to say that child poverty affects all aspects of children's lives, so it affects every part of childhood, whether that's education, well-being, social and emotional relationships, but it also has this lasting effect on children's outcomes and right through into what children earn as adults as well. And it's very cumulative, so the longer a child is in poverty and the deeper a child is in poverty, the worse that has on their effects on their outcomes. But it's certainly not inevitable, and as I say, policies have lifted children out of poverty and pulled them into poverty as well.
Could I ask you to slow down?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
And just a moment ago, Ms. Anstey, you'd mentioned the depth of poverty, and I think, is it right that the severity or depth of poverty, or in other words, how far households are from a basic standard of living, is also something that Child Poverty Action Group measures?
Yeah, so I mentioned the households below average income data set that we look at. That sets the poverty line at 60% of the median income in society. When we talk about deep poverty, we're looking at households that are 50% or below. Unfortunately, the number or the group of children below that 50% mark has also increased in recent years. And as I alluded to, where children live in deep poverty, that has a kind of worse effect. They're less likely to be able to afford the food that they need, less likely to be able to live in a warm home, and we know that that has severe detrimental effects for children.
Thank you. We'll perhaps just turn then to look at the profile of child poverty in the UK just before the pandemic. Can you confirm that in early 2020, just before the pandemic started, there were 4.3 million children, and I think you've already said that that's equivalent to 30% of all children in the UK living in relative poverty after housing costs?
Yes, so that is correct. So as we went into the pandemic, I mentioned that child poverty had been increasing in the kind of decade leading up to that. Family incomes had been heavily eroded by cuts and freezes to the social security system. So lots of families were coming into the pandemic in a pretty bad state. As you say, there was 4.3 million children living below the poverty line. Households also had very little in terms of savings. So because their income had been eroded, there was very little to fall back on. And therefore kind of households, any kind of income shock was going to hit households badly. I suppose there are also groups of children that were even higher risk or more likely to be in poverty. So when we think about, 31% is the sort of overall percentage of children, but when we think about children in black and minority ethnic groups, the percentage was significantly higher coming into the pandemic, so around 46%. Families in black and minority ethnic families are more likely to be in kind of lower paid jobs, more insecure income, more likely to have to have used the social security system, which I already said have been, many, many cuts have been made to it. So they're an example of a group that were particularly vulnerable coming into the pandemic. I think it's also worth saying that families with 3 or more children were another group that were very vulnerable. So some of those cuts I alluded to, the 2-child limit in particular, has meant that poverty among families with 3 or more children has increased. And, we can imagine if you have a household with 3 or more children, there's just more mouths to feed, and you're more likely to have increased costs. And therefore, when there's an economic change or a change of circumstances, it's very difficult. And one final group I think it's important to talk about is migrant families. So again, very, very vulnerable. So families, particularly those with no recourse to public funds. Lots of families will have been working, but actually they have no access to any of the benefit system or the vast majority of the benefit system. So, they're unable, I guess there's a much greater chance that they're living in deep poverty and at much greater risk of destitution because if anything happens to work, then they have nothing to fall back on.
Thank you, Ms. Anstey. And just, if I may, if I could pull on a few threads from that answer. I think you had mentioned in the course of your answer that some children who were living in poverty will have been living in families where a parent or carer was in work. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned over the 2010s that child poverty had risen. Also, when we look into the data, in-work poverty has risen quite significantly as well. So around 7 in 10 children who were living in poverty at the start of the pandemic, their households or someone in their household was in work, but that work simply wasn't paying enough to lift them above the poverty line. So again, the sort of insecure, low incomes were having an effect on that, and that's a more of a kind of newer phenomenon in terms of poverty.
And Ms. Anstey, I want to ask you about some longer term trends prior to the pandemic, which I think might be relevant to your evidence about the pandemic. In your statement, you have said that family income is the strongest statistical predictor of how well a child will achieve in school. And you highlight that a 16-year-old's family income is more than 4 times as strong a predictor of GCSE attainment as their local authority of residence. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think there is now there's more and more evidence coming through to show that, as you say, the income at home is the strongest sort of determinant of how well a child will get on in school, more so than where they grow up or other factors. The evidence is also weighted that this is a causal link, so it's not just a correlation, that there's sort of causal evidence of the impact of income on education. And I think in our work, we see this firsthand. We're in schools talking to children and young people. We know that every part of the school day is very hard to access. If you don't have much money, not having the right uniform, or being able to get pay for the bus to school. And as you say, once children are kind of in the school system, at every measure and milestone, children on a lower income are worse off than their peers. So whether that's right when they come into school or right the way through to GCSEs and A-levels, we see there is a kind of gap between, and that's very much a poverty-related attainment gap that we see in the progress data and the attainment data. I think beyond just looking at academic attainment, there are lots of other ways in which children on a low income fare worse in the school setting. So they're much more likely to be absent from school, more likely to be suspended or excluded. They're also more likely to say that they don't have the same sense of belonging in school or feel isolated. So I think that paints a picture of it's much harder for children to get on in school if they're facing poverty, and we know the sort of effects of that. Yeah, and I think, as I say, it's very clear from our work why that is the case and the links between the two, both the fact that you don't have everything that you need, the kind of material deprivation of not having food or resources, but also the stress that poverty puts on the family home as well, making it much harder to support children at school as well.
Thank you. I'd like to move on now to look at the impact of COVID-19 on the number of children living in poverty. Can you explain whether rates of child poverty increased during the pandemic?
So, yeah, I think it's really important to say that when the pandemic hit, the government did put in place measures to recognise the fact that lots of families would be struggling. So the most significant policy that came in was an uplift to universal credit and working tax credits. So the government rolled out a £20 increase to those benefits. That, I mean, if that hadn't come in, things would have been much, much worse for families. And we did see, as a result of that policy change, child poverty dropped from 4.3 million down to 3.9 million. So I think that's a really key demonstration of, the levers that government have and can pull that really do affect the number of children living in poverty. And it was shown that that could be done during the pandemic. But it's important to say that policy really had its limitations. So
sorry, I'm going to have to stop you there, Ms. Anstey. I've got to be really careful that when it comes to individual modules, I make sure that anything I put into a report is based on a fair assessment of the evidence. And when it comes to economic support and response, I'm going to be dealing with that in Module 9. And that's where I'll look at the breadth of support, particularly for vulnerable people, and its effectiveness. So what I can't do is go down this particular path today. You can say what the situation was like as a fact, but you can't then, I'm afraid. Analyse. I'm really sorry to stop you because I know it's a cause in which you believe wholeheartedly, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop you there.
No problem.
Just picking up on the change in the rates of child poverty across the pandemic, in your statement, you've pointed out that the latest figures published in March 2025 show that of an approximate total of 14 million children in the UK, a record 4.5 million children are now currently living in poverty. And I think you make the point that that has increased since 2020.
Yes, so that measure, the support was brought in during the pandemic, that £20 uplift, where we saw that drop in child poverty, but that was later removed, and subsequently child poverty rates have gone up, and there have been other factors that have caused that increase as well. is it a good time to talk about other support during the pandemic, for example, kind of free school meals provision or?
Well, perhaps I
Someone
could
is
just
that?
ask you about the reasons for the increase. You've mentioned that there were other factors. Is one of the reasons for that increase that workers in households with children who were already on means tested benefits were more likely to lose their job and become furloughed?
Yeah, so for families on a low income during the pandemic, they faced a particularly tough time, and there were two reasons for that. As you say, those living on a lower income were much more likely to, yes, face redundancies, but also have their hours reduced or have to take on greater caring responsibilities, and therefore they couldn't work as much. And as you said, they were coming into this, those that had already been on means-tested benefits, they were coming into this with particularly sort of unprotected household incomes in the first place, and that got worse. So loss of income was a big factor, but at the same time, families in lower income households faced increased costs. So having your children at home, also in many cases having children return back home or other family members come back home meant there were more people in the house, therefore the need for more food, lots of families using more of heating bills, etc., needing to find entertainment for children. So the increase in costs was significant. And actually, the reason that that's different to kind of higher income households is lower income households spend a much bigger proportion of their income on essentials. Whereas if you're in a higher income household, you may have spent more of your income on recreation or culture, and lots of those things fell away in the pandemic. So those households, in terms of savings and income, were much better protected, whereas in a lower income household, they really felt the impact of those increased costs while children were at home. And as well as the things I've mentioned, our research found very strongly that lower income families were having to spend more on things like learning resources because they didn't have what they needed coming into the pandemic. So a combination of those two things meant that lower income families in particular were hit very badly when everybody was kind of locked down and at home.
And Ms. Anstey, some people might associate the pandemic with an opportunity to save money because they're not leaving home, they're not having to travel. Just to confirm, was that the case for families on low incomes?
So as I said kind of earlier, families were coming in a bad state and they had very little savings, if any, already. But at the point where children and everybody was locked down at home, it was incredibly difficult for lower income families to save at that point because of, as I say, far more likely to face those decreased incomes and more likely to have increased costs, and that being a much bigger proportion of their income. And I suppose other things, again, I don't know if it's okay to touch on this, but other things that had been eroding family incomes, like the 2-child limit and benefit cap, remained in place during the pandemic as well. So nothing, again, children were overlooked in terms of the response, the economic response.
Thank you. And I'd just like to look at the specific challenges that children living in poverty faced as a result of school closures in particular. And I think you've already touched on some of those aspects in that answer. But did school closures contribute in other ways to the financial pressures that families were experiencing?
Yeah, so I think in the first instance, it's important to say that schools provide many protective factors to children living on a low income, or to children more generally, but particularly those on a low income. So they help with food, whether that's kind of breakfast clubs in the morning or free school meals. They support because they have learning materials readily available. They provide after-school provision, extracurricular activities, which families very much welcome, as well as kind of wider services and support in terms of mental health and access to other services. So there's a whole raft of things that schools do. And lots of those things, it's very difficult for families to replicate and provide at home. And I think that very much came into very clear focus when the lockdown began. and children and families were very quickly asked to move on to kind of online learning and try and kind of keep up their education from home. And lower-income families simply were not set up to be able to do that. We know that there was a big digital divide going into the pandemic. Through our research, children and families told us they did not have the essential items that they needed, whether that's kind of laptops, other devices. That was a major barrier for families. I think as well as digital items, we heard lots about non-digital items that families didn't have, stationery, crafts, things like printers were particularly important. We heard about parents having to wake up early in the morning to write out worksheets because they didn't have a printer at home. So access to resources was a big concern for families. On top of that, there was things in terms of the home environment. So families on a low income were more likely to be in overcrowded housing conditions, poor quality housing, less likely for children to have somewhere to learn, somewhere quiet to learn, and siblings and other family members being around. And on top of that, we heard from parents, particularly on a low income, that they struggled sometimes with the confidence or the capacity to be able to support children while they were learning at home. And I think just to give an example of that, we heard particularly from lone parent families who are predominantly mothers, that period was incredibly difficult with trying to still bring in income and work, but support children while they were learning from home. And we know that lone parents struggled kind of far more so during that period. But yeah, it was a very difficult time, and I think that it was unsurprising that gap in learning and the fact that children in lower income homes were less able to access education online, because we knew about some of those issues that already existed, and it bore out very strongly.
Thank you, Miss Anstey. And I think in your statement you've touched there upon the difficulties that children living in poverty would have had in terms of accessing devices and other non-digital materials. You touch on this in your statement and make the point that that would have been compounded by other measures that have been put in place. Can you tell us a bit more about how that would have been compounded by other wider societal measures? Yeah, so one of the things that came through very strongly in our work is that prior to the pandemic, a proportion of children were eligible for free school meals. We were very clear prior to the pandemic that measure and the number of families that were eligible was far too low. So around 1 in 3 children in poverty did not qualify for free school food prior to the pandemic because that threshold was inadequate. When children went home and went into lockdown, those families that were ineligible prior to the pandemic did significantly suffer. As I said, low-income families faced big shocks. They faced rises in food costs at home, and they didn't have any support. And often in school, there is kind of ad hoc support provided. Schools know about families that might be struggling but may not be accessing or entitled to free school meals. So there was a group that we were particularly worried about, and we know that they continued to struggle with food costs in the pandemic. But I suppose for those that were eligible, there were also significant challenges. So schools, when lockdown first happened in March 2020, schools did try to put in place kind of provision and alternative support that was very patchy. The government then tried to set up a national system. So through Edenred, they said that families could access vouchers in order for them to be able to purchase food. But very quickly, and we were very concerned about this, very quickly it became apparent that system wasn't working particularly well, both in terms of the administration, so there was lots of issues with codes and access, but also in terms of the design of the system. So those vouchers were limited to certain supermarkets. In the first instance, families couldn't get change back from it. It had to be spent all at once. Again, they were some of these families were living very far away from the places that they were able to buy food from. So actually, it was quite chaotic in terms of whether families were or weren't able to access that food. And our understanding from the data is that only around half of families who were eligible were accessing provision in April 2020. From our research across the UK,
there was different kind of approaches to free school meals. We did see in Scotland and Wales lots of local authorities moving to a cash-first approach. So what we mean by that is bank transfers to families of the amount that had been decided so they could buy their own food. And that very much came through from our survey work as the most preferred option for families in terms of receiving support. It meant that they could have choice of where to shop. It was much safer because they could shop online if they wanted to, and it gave them the kind of dignity and discretion that they wanted, therefore obviously not having to go into a shop and it being very clear that you're using a voucher. So that was happening elsewhere in the UK. In England, there was no indication to schools that they could use cash first as an approach, and obviously the preferred option was for families to use the Eden Red voucher scheme, which was, as I said, kind of had many limitations. And the impact on children is clear that these households couldn't get access to food or enough food, and that was another thing that was weighing heavily when children are trying to learn and get on.
Thank you, Ms Sandsty. I'd like to just ask you specifically then, before we move on from the impact of school closures, about the impact of school closures on the well-being of children living in poverty. And I think it's right that it's the lack of devices for children living in poverty equally limited their opportunities to stay in touch with their friends during the pandemic, and I think that's something your research has identified.
Yeah, so this came through very strongly from children and young people, that not only were they, I suppose in terms of well-being and mental health, they were very stressed about falling behind. So on an education level, they were very worried about not being able to keep up. The fact that they couldn't access lessons or feedback from teachers meant that, their concerns about their education were very strong, particularly for teenagers. But yeah, as you say, that kind of social, the connectivity piece was also a big challenge for families. So not being able to stay in touch with friends, not being able to join some of the lessons that were kind of group lessons or group activities, not being able to get feedback from teachers or have conversations with teachers as well was also a challenge. And I think what we heard from children and young people is that they felt more and more isolated and cut off, and therefore kind of worries and anxiety grew within that. And I suppose also from a mental health perspective, lower income parents were facing a whole kind of myriad of challenges, as I alluded to, so the costs, income, having to look after children, having to juggle work. And that stress at home also had a kind of knock-on effect on children and young people kind of feeling that in the household. So I would say that it was a very, lots of children struggled during the pandemic, but if you're living on a low income, lots of those factors were coming together to make things particularly difficult.
And
I'll ask you again to slow down.
Yes.
Otherwise I can have a stenographer on strike.
And stepping back then, Ms Anstey, from school closures, you also make the point that wider public health restrictions constrain low-income families' access to other forms of informal support. Can you explain the ways in which that impacted upon the children living in those families?
Yeah, so in normal times, low-income families will pull on lots of different forms of support to help them through. So whether that's very informally from friends and family, going around to someone's house to have dinner, or whether that's accessing things like food banks or other kind of charitable provision. As we said in the statement, though that type of support was no longer readily available to families or accessible, and therefore that was another way in which children and families were cut off. And I suppose in terms of the impact, it just meant that, again, resources at home, what children had access to in terms of food and fun, were far more limited.
Thank you. And you've just mentioned food banks. I believe that you also highlight in your statement that there had been an increase in the numbers of families accessing food banks throughout the pandemic. To what extent, Ms Anstey, is that a helpful indicator for those of us seeking to better understand whether there was an increase in financial need for those families?
Yeah, so I think in our statement we talk about a few different things that we saw during the pandemic that are indicators of increased need. So yes, we saw an increase in the number of families going to food banks. We saw an increase in the number of families who are registered for free school meals. And we saw an increase in the in applications for universal credit. These are all kind of indicators of increased hardship. And I think this is kind of combined with our work talking to families about the difficulties that they faced. So for lower income families, the pandemic presented a number of challenges, and that they were working very hard to try and continue to support their children and meet their needs. But clearly that was a challenge. But I think those things are certainly indicators, but maybe it's hard sometimes to disentangle, because particularly with free school meals, there was also an increased awareness of free school meals, and also families feeling less stigma applying for free school meals when they're receiving things at home rather than children accessing them in school. So yeah, these are all kind of helpful indicators.
I understand, that's very helpful, thank you. And reflecting on those challenges that we've been discussing, Ms. Anstey, to what extent do you consider that they would have been foreseeable prior to the pandemic?
So I think the evidence was very clear prior to the pandemic that child poverty was significantly rising. Around 36 billion had been taken out of the social security system over the sort of decade in the lead up to the pandemic. I touched on already that there were groups that were particularly vulnerable to any economic shock. And that certainly played out in the pandemic, and those families were harder hit. So I think we have a responsibility to protect children and families at all times, and make sure they have sufficient income and they have enough to be able to support and raise their children. But particularly that becomes sort of, we're kind of acutely aware of it in the pandemic setting. But I think better support and provision could have been in place to make sure that when there was a crisis or an economic shock, that families could better withstand that. And that simply wasn't the case.
And Ms. Anstey, I want to move on then to ask you about Child Poverty Action Group's understanding and identification of longer term or enduring impacts of the pandemic for children living in poverty. Through your work, have you identified any enduring impacts?
Yeah, so why broadly child poverty continues to rise, and family incomes, as I say, had been eroded. That wasn't sufficiently addressed in the pandemic. We then went into a cost of living crisis. So families' incomes have taken a hammering, essentially, and not enough support has been done to turn that around. But I suppose specifically thinking about children and young people, we know that in an educational sense that that gap, that poverty-related attainment gap, although it kind of stopped widening before the pandemic, that has certainly got much wider following the pandemic. And although there are bits of progress being made, the numbers are very clear that there is a much greater gap now than there was prior to the pandemic. As well, things like attendance, school attendance. We've seen an increase in children, particularly low-income children, not attending school, and an increase in persistent absence. So that's another way in which sort of education has been affected. We also carried out a big piece of research with school staff in 2023, and they were very clear that the impact of poverty on education had got much worse since COVID-19. And I think when we look at the data, those in more affluent households, those in private schools, they suffered a much smaller learning loss during that time than those in disadvantaged households. So the educational impacts are very clear, and I think will continue to that will continue to play out. In terms of other impacts, it was very clear to us when we were doing the research during the pandemic that children were concerned about their own mental health and well-being, the limited sort of social connections that they'd had. And again, we are seeing evidence of the kind of longer-term effects of that now. So children living on a low income are more likely to face mental health challenges in normal times, but certainly the effects of the pandemic exacerbated those challenges. And that, again, we're I think schools have also reported they're seeing much more evidence of children struggling with mental health, struggling with their well-being, and trying to address that. So yeah, those are some of the ways in which I think that we are seeing the longer term effects, and it also shows that not enough was done at the time, and sort of through as a recovery and a response to recovery to address some of those issues.
Thank you. And finally then, moving on to your lessons learned and recommendations. Ms Anstey, bearing in mind the various challenges and difficulties that we've been discussing in the course of your evidence, are there any practical things the Child Poverty Action Group considers could be done to better protect children living in poverty in the event of a future pandemic?
Yeah, so in the context of the pandemic, we had some very clear recommendations. I've touched on this already, but providing cash-first support to families when you need to replace free school meals, for example, we know that that was very much the best and most efficient way to help families during that period, and it didn't have the same challenges as other options. So cash-first support is something we would call for. Making sure children have all that they need to take part in learning is also really crucial, and we see that we still continue to see in our research today that children can't fully participate in education because they don't always have everything that they need, whether that's for home learning or learning in school. So we really encourage that to be a priority for government to think about learning. We were very clear about the recovery and investment in recovery, looking at children in the round, so not just thinking of them as vehicles for learning and attainment, but also thinking about how they can be best supported in terms of their mental health and well-being and kind of reintegration back into school, and we feel that that was significantly overlooked. Another recommendation from us was that wraparound care should have been a really important part of the recovery, so making sure that before and after school provision was available, because it has kind of academic benefits, but it also is an opportunity for children to socialise and play, take part in extracurricular activities, and it supports parents to work more if they choose to. So those were some of the recommendations that were very much kind of we called for during the pandemic. I've obviously touched on the fact that, the government did pull certain levers during the pandemic to support families, but because families were in such a bad state prior to that, it wasn't enough to protect them. So I think we're very clear that children and families need to be protected. To protect them inside a pandemic, you have to protect them outside of a pandemic as well. So of course, we include in that making sure the social security system is adequate so that families have enough money to support their children and meet their needs. And there are obviously certain changes to the social security system that we'd like to see to address that, but adequacy being the main thing. Beyond that, I think there are frameworks that could be put in place to make sure that children's rights are very much embedded at every level of decision-making in government. So others have called for this as well, but we would certainly support calls around incorporating the UNCRC into domestic law. And that's a good way to make sure that children's rights are considered and prioritised. Alongside that, making sure that children's rights impact assessments are a statutory requirement. Again, that provides a framework for children's rights to be understood and acknowledged, and to understand what impact policies and legislation will have on children. And then finally, having a cabinet minister with the responsibility for children. And I think that is really crucial, to have somebody at the very heart of government who is representing and advocating for children when critical decisions are being made. And at the moment, we don't have that. We have somebody who is responsible for children's education, but that doesn't consider children and their rights in the round.
Thank you very much, Ms Anstey. My lady, I have no further questions.
Thank you. You were talking about recovery a moment ago, and I think Mr Broach is going to pursue that a little further. He's behind you, but can you make sure you speak into the microphone?
Yes, of course.
Yes.
My lady, I'm grateful. Ms Anstey, could we turn please to paragraphs 174 to 180 of your statement, where you look at return to school and recovery funding, that issue that you just touched on. You refer to Sir Kevin Collins' recommendations for an ambitious recovery programme for education and wider childhood, with a 15 billion funding commitment, 12 billion of which would be paid directly to schools and used to help disadvantaged pupils. Could you expand on CPAG's views on the UK government's decision in respect of recovery funding in the aftermath of the pandemic, after schools reopened in May 2021 up to June of the following year. What were the impacts of those decisions, in your view?
Yeah, so in terms of the approach to recovery, it was clear that the government recognised the very detrimental effect that the pandemic had had on children and that they'd suffered. And they stated that education recovery would be a kind of priority agenda. As we heard, they brought in Education Recovery Czar, Sir Kevin Collins, who was asked to understand the scale of the challenge and present sort of a solution to that. Kevin Collins presented the 15 billion package, and that included extending the school day for 30 minutes to make sure that children could have that access to academic support, but also some of the things I touched on in terms of wider educational support, extracurricular activities, etc. At the same time, I talked about this, but CPAG were very much calling for investment in wraparound care and provision. We saw that as a really crucial part of getting children back to school, helping them to catch up both on learning but also on other aspects. And we know that that support before and after school can help with socialising and supporting children's mental health. So we were calling for that, and we were calling for a robust package of recovery that took into account children's needs in the round. The response from government was that broad package was rejected, and instead the government favoured a much more narrow approach to recovery, whereby there was funding, although a much smaller amount than Sir Kevin Collins recommended, and that was very much focused on the National Tutoring Programme, as well as some per-pupil funding. But I will see that per-pupil funding was much lower in the UK and in England than it was in other countries, for example, the Netherlands and the USA. So they had a very narrow focus on learning and a very reduced package. And I would say CPAG's view is that the government had access to the evidence and, as we understand, and the knowledge of what was needed to help children and young people recover from something that had disproportionately affected them. But that I suppose CPAG remains unclear as to why the government, with that evidence and knowledge, did not carry forward those proposals, being told that that's what was needed for children and young people, and that was the type of investment that was needed, and therefore kind of overlooking once more children in their policy making. And I think from our perspective, those decisions made at that time that as I say, overlooked children and young people are continuing to play out in what we're seeing, and some of the things I've touched on in terms of children falling behind academically, there being a larger kind of poverty-related attainment gap, but also children's general kind of well-being, and how their kind of quality of life and how they feel about school.
Thank you very much. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roach. Thank you very much, Ms. Anstey. You spend a lot of your time actually doing the advocacy for Child Poverty Action Group.
I'm half and half with research in schools and then the policy and advocacy.
Well, you've obviously got all the facts at your fingertips. So thank you very much indeed for the help you've given, and any of your colleagues who've contributed to the work for the inquiry. So I'm really grateful. Thank you
so much. Thank you.
Right, I think we've finished earlier than we had expected. So I shall adjourn for lunch now and return at 1:45.
All right.